Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we've been talking a lot about Napoleon lately with the film coming out, and I did a review of my reaction to the video, to the movie, and so we've been talking a lot about the history of Napoleon, and I don't want anybody to get Napoleon fatigue, so we are going to be stepping away from Napoleon. We will come back to more Napoleonic War history, and at some point I will be visiting some battlefields in 2024 associated with the Napoleonic Wars. But I did want to cover one last aspect of the history of Napoleon before we move on to some other things. And that is that I think we do ourselves a disservice when we think of Napoleon as an emperor, as a military leader only. And we ignore much of his legacy, which exists in the form of political and governmental reforms, many of which exist to this day. So like most figures in history, Napoleon's complicated. It's not a black and white thing. He wasn't just a tyrant, and he wasn't just a benevolent leader. He wasn't just a dictator. He wasn't just a general. He's kind of all of these things in one, right? So I want to dive into that topic a little bit, and we're going to go to our friends, Kings and Generals, who actually just came out with this video called, "Was Napoleon a Military Tyrant or a Reformer?" And of course, the question is he not all of those things? Well, that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. Before we do that, I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Sean in Malta, and also to Michael in Tempe, Arizona. Thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. Could not do this without you. As always, the link is in the description. This is a fairly new video. I don't typically react to videos this soon after they come out, but it's pretty timely because of Napoleon, and I thought this was a great topic to cover. So I want to encourage everyone to check out Kings and Generals. If you haven't already seen this video, please watch some of their other stuff. They have some of the best historic content on this platform. I am proud to be a patron of theirs, and I invite many of you to support them as well. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died in exile on the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. Nearly 20 years later, in 1840, the British government granted French King Louis Philippe permission to return Napoleon's body to his home country of France. Later that year, a state funeral was held for the late French emperor, after which Napoleon's remains were interred in a sarcophagus situated in a crypt under the dome of Les Invalides.
So isn't that fascinating that it's under the restored French monarchy that Napoleon's body is brought home and given these honors, right? Because Napoleon was very much an anti-monarchist during his rise, right? Before he becomes emperor, he was very much about the revolution and about the republic and the idea of France electing its leaders. Even so much so that, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, that when he became emperor, he insisted on there being a vote to ratify that decision. Now, there were some funny numbers that were done, but it was an overwhelming victory either way, in terms of the plebiscite, the actual vote to kind of approve it. He just made it even more of a great victory, but
he lies to this day. The exiled emperor's return to France brought out great patriotic sentiment among the people, some of whom longed rather nostalgically for the return of a Bonapartist emperor to lead France to greatness. But Napoleon's image and historical legacy has remained a divisive topic among scholars and in popular opinion in the many years after his death.
And they did get another Bonapartist emperor. You have Napoleon III, who is Napoleon's nephew, who eventually comes to the throne in another coup and is emperor for nearly 2 decades before he loses his throne as a result of the Franco-Prussian War. We are going to do some original content at some point here in the near future, where we're going to talk about Napoleon's legacy, because he's got a lot of descendants and his brother's descendants and a lot of very interesting people, including many Americans who are descended from the Bonaparte family. And I think it'll be an interesting dive to take a look at that. In fact, one of Napoleon's grand nephews was the American Attorney General who oversaw the creation of what became the FBI.
Was he a self-made man who rose up in the military, social and political ranks through his charismatic leadership and bold style of action?
Partially.
If so, did Napoleon perceive his rise to absolute power over France as a necessity in order to achieve needed reform and continued progress to a revolution that had stagnated into violence and chaos over the past decade?
Yeah, I think that unlike some people that we call dictators, who really are all about themselves and the power, I legit believe that Napoleon, rightly or wrongly, truly believed that his rule over France was the best thing for France. And I really, truly believe that many of the things he did benefit France, more so than most people who come to power the way that he did.
Or was Napoleon a ruthless, opportunistic autocrat who let his ego and lust for power get the better of him, taking advantage of the turbulent revolution for his own personal gain,
Partially
and leading
true,
France into a series of wars that would cost countless lives? In this video, we will be examining the two sides of Napoleon Bonaparte's legacy, Napoleon the Reformer and Napoleon the Tyrant. This video is made possible thanks to the generous support of our YouTube members and patrons. Their contributions are the backbone of our work. As a token of our appreciation, our patrons and YouTube members enjoy 2 exclusive videos every week.
Yeah, and I'll say this. Listen, as somebody who is on YouTube and obviously has a lot of patrons as well, please do not ever underestimate the importance of Patreon as a means of making content possible on YouTube. Obviously there's ad revenue to be had and things like that, but that doesn't go nearly as far as you might think it does, and YouTube takes a big chunk of it. So Patreon's a big deal, and I'm immensely grateful for our patrons and members on here, and I know that Kings and Generals are too.
Currently, they have access to a complete series on Xenophon's Anabasis, the First Punic War, History of Prussia, Italian Unification Wars, Risorgimento, and numerous other fun videos. Additionally, our Pacific War series is ongoing, and we're excited to announce the release of a new series on the Russo-Japanese War and Albigensian Crusades, and much more, exclusively for our backers. If you want to join this fantastic community, you can find the links in the video description and pinned comment. By becoming a patron or YouTube member, you'll gain access to exclusive videos, early access to all our public content, release schedules, wallpapers, and an invitation to our active Discord server, where we engage in lively discussions. Your support is invaluable, and we sincerely thank you for making our work possible. Napoleon Bonaparte was fortunate to have been born in the time he was.
Yeah.
When the French
We
Revolution...
talked about this in some other videos I've done about Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte, born 30 years earlier, we probably never hear of him. Even with all the same skills and abilities that he had, that's only part of the equation. I guarantee there have been other equally brilliant minds, military minds to him, that just were born in the wrong time where they never really had those opportunities. Every person who makes their mark on history in a significant way, it's a combination of skill and ability, of luck, of being born in the right time and place, of having the right people around you who put you in positions, because nobody is completely self-made. Everybody has help. Everybody's given opportunities. Napoleon's no different. If he's not given the opportunities that he's given early in his military career, he never gets the chance to show what he can do. If he's born in a different time in history, maybe there's no need for his abilities and skills, and so we never hear about them. There's so many factors.
Broke out in 1789. He was 20 years old, in a Europe that was experiencing the twilight and decline of the old dynastic monarchies, save for Great Britain. He personally claimed he was lucky to have been born into the lower nobility of Corsica, which allowed him easier access into the ranks of the Ancien Regime's exclusive aristocratic officer corps.
That's a fair point. Napoleon was not born a nobody, right? He was not like this dirt poor lower class guy. He is of a decent class of people, upper middle class, you might say, lower upper class, who's born at a time when Corsica becomes French, and that affords his family some very unique opportunities.
and when the revolution erupted in 1789, his lower Corsican birth did not hinder his rise through the ranks of the new Republican army and government. His marriage to Parisian socialite Josephine de Beauharnais also gained him access to the...
Who, by the way, never went by the name Josephine before she met Napoleon. She was typically known as Rose. I mean, people had a lot of names back then, kind of like, Marquis de Lafayette was like Gilbert Roche du Motier, Joseph Yves Paul, like all these names are in there. So she was typically known as Rose. But he called her Josephine, and that's kind of what she went by. And she never really went by de Beauharnais. That was her husband's name, her first husband's name. But it wasn't something she was typically ever known by during her lifetime.
Moderate royalist faction within Paris, who would greatly assist him in his eventual ascension to power. Regarding the argument that Napoleon was a great reformer and self-made man, Napoleon would leave a lasting legacy throughout Europe through creating legal codexes and forging national identities which still exist to this day. When he became first consul of France after his coup over the Directory in 1799, he found himself running a legislature that was struggling to get by on even the basic necessities of governance.
This is the thing about the coup. Was it a coup? Absolutely. Was it even necessarily his idea? No. It was actually someone else's idea, and he was brought in to be the military muscle and saw an opportunity in that he took advantage of, and he becomes first consul among three consuls, and he really becomes the guy with all the power. But he really did come in at a time when the existing system was broken. That doesn't justify a coup, and please, everything I'm saying here, I'm trying to push back against certain ideas that people have formed over time about Napoleon as this tyrant, this dictator, this kind of military guy, and that's really all he was good at. I'm pushing back at that with my arguments. I'm not suggesting that it was okay that he committed a military coup, that it was okay he took power the way that he did, or that millions of people dying in wars is okay. I'm trying to give us a more well-rounded understanding of the man and of the times in which he lived.
The Constitution of 1799 left much to be desired for ensuring a strong central government. Napoleon immediately set out to reorganize the government's executive branch, known as the Council of State. As first consul, he ensured that he was the most important of the three co-consuls,
Listen, he did not jump in as first consul and immediately say, hey, who can we conquer? Let's go fight a bunch of wars and take over Europe, okay? He actually started out by trying to make peace with people like the British and the Austrians and the Russians and try to guarantee long-term stability. He also immediately sets out like dramatically reforming the legal system and the governmental system of France and of the territories that they ruled at that time.
In theory, were supposed to be working together and sharing equal power over the council. Through his cunning, charismatic ways, he was able to take advantage of the distrust that many of the ministers in the council held for one another, reducing their power and greatly diminishing their role in governance by subdividing the various ministries. Although he mostly kept second-rate politicians in the ministry posts, Napoleon was ably assisted in running the executive by two invaluable statesmen, Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord and Joseph Fouché, Napoleon's Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Police, respectively.
And you want to talk about people who are really in it for themselves? Talleyrand. Holy cow, that dude was a political opportunist. Listen, I'm not saying he didn't have talent and skill and didn't do some really beneficial things for France, because he did. But he also did a lot of things that were really beneficial for Talleyrand.
The legislative branch of the Republic was in an even worse state than the executive when Napoleon took the office of First Consul. Through the 1799 Constitution, the legislature was divided into three assemblies. There was a 60-man Senate, tasked with upholding the Constitution and the laws of France. This body was filled with loyal followers and lackeys of Napoleon. Then there was the 100-seat Tribunate, which prepared new laws and legislations on the suggestions of the Council of State.
You notice the heavy influence of the Roman Empire in all of this. That's intentional. And that's not just Napoleon who made that happen. It was others as well. But Napoleon was heavily influenced and looked up to people like Julius Caesar, but also people like Alexander.
Finally, there was the legislative corps of 300 deputies, each selected from the various departments, who were to vote on proposed legislation, but without any chance for debate or discussion on the floor. The tribunate would prove the most difficult of the three for Napoleon to work with, opposing Napoleon's concordat with Rome and even rejecting the first draft of his proposed civil code. Napoleon wasted little time in reining in the legislature. As to the tribunate's resistance, he responded in 1803 by increasing the size of the Senate by a further 40 loyal members.
Pack the Senate!
He halved the sizes of both the tribunate and the legislative corps and declared that he alone would have the power to appoint the 2 presidents of the assemblies.
So these are some of the things where you can really argue, okay, Napoleon's kind of taking a little too much power and authority here, right? He couldn't get things done that he thought were beneficial to the country, and so he made changes that made it possible for him to consolidate power. Those are the marks of a dictator, of, some might argue, a tyrant.
The tribunate was abolished entirely within 4 years. Regarding the stability and public order of France, Napoleon ensured the happiness of the masses through several methods. He took great measures to assure the common folk that he was on their side, passing a revolutionary land settlement through the legislature. In this settlement, he secured the common peasants' loyalty by allowing them to retain their acres of lands originally seized from the church and nobility during the early phases of the revolution.
Yeah, so he makes this deal with the church in Rome. And remember, during the French Revolution, there was a big backlash against the church, so much so that there's almost a state atheism for a while. But then even after that, where religion is kind of allowed, it's not really viewed very highly. Napoleon allows the church some of its influence back, but he also does that in part because he recognizes the importance of religion in helping to kind of control the people a little bit at this time. So Napoleon was the kind of guy who, I'm not entirely sure exactly what he believed, because he so often used religion as a means of, as a political means. You know, he would embrace Islam when he was in Egypt, for example, and he would embrace Roman Catholicism when he was in Italy, and Protestantism when he was in Germany. And so I think he's probably a deist of some kind. He probably believes in God, but not necessarily a guy that's all about organized religion. But he recognized its importance and came to this understanding with the church.
He restored the confidence of the religious peasantry in the countryside by passing the Concordat with Rome. The Republican government of the French Revolution had urged the creation of a secular, non-religious state and society in France, but the Concordat with Rome restored the status of Roman Catholicism as France's predominant religion. In urban centres, Napoleon kept the masses happy through Roman-style bread and circuses. He was a great patron of the arts, particularly to suit his needs in the field of propaganda, where he sponsored great works of art by the French painter Jacques-Louis David, which glorified the ideals of the French Revolution, France's recent victories over the coalition armies of Europe, and of course Napoleon himself.
Napoleon was a master propagandist. The difference with Napoleon with a lot of people who are master propagandists is he actually had some things that were worth promoting. He didn't have to, I wouldn't say he didn't lie, because he did at times. He didn't have to lie as much or stretch the truth as much. He more had to just promote what was true and make sure that people focused on certain things.
Through his campaigns in Italy and Egypt, Napoleon pleased the people by adding to France's growing treasures in art and cultural collection. Priceless pieces of Renaissance art and ancient riches were looted from cities in Italy and tombs in Egypt, and brought back to France to be displayed at the Louvre, Paris's newly repurposed public museum. For public works and infrastructure, Napoleon sponsored massive architectural projects in Paris that glorified his reign and the French Empire, such as the Arc de Triomphe and several new bridges over the Seine, each named for his great military victories. Napoleon also openly
Think about the subtleness of that, right? It's something that's a project that helps the country, right? Building new bridges, for example, in the capital city. but it's also every time you cross that bridge, you're thinking about the victories that were won. And so it kind of has that dual effect.
Encouraged popular welfare, so long as it didn't conflict with current government policies and interests. Through his propaganda efforts, public and cultural works, and legislative measures that, on paper at least, supported the common people of France, he gained the support and loyalty of the masses for his many wars and campaigns.
And again, people wonder, why would hundreds of thousands of men over and over and over again go off to die for a guy like Napoleon? There was a strong sense of patriotism for France here, right? They saw this as France against the world, and in many ways it was. Because how did all of this get started? It started with countries declaring war on France because of their revolution. It was an effort by external forces to restore the French monarchy and to bring stability to that part of Europe. And France said, you can't come in and tell us what to do. We're going to decide for ourselves. Imagine if the United States had a election, or with the American Revolution, for example, we overthrow the British and decide that we want to have our own republic. And then all of the neighboring countries decided, no, you're going to be ruled by the British, and we're going to send our armies in to tell you that you're going to continue to be ruled by the British. Wouldn't Americans feel a sense of duty to fight against that? That's what they're fighting for. And it didn't hurt that they had a general and later an emperor who won them great victories and who they felt personally connected to because he was a charismatic leader and he did have the love of his men. All of that is a factor in why Napoleon was so successful early on.
He would maintain the common people's full cooperation until the conscription measures in the later phases of Napoleon's reign deteriorated this relationship. Napoleon also went to great lengths to reform France's finances following the economic crises of the Revolution. The revolutionary government had already done much to do away with the burdensome taxation system of the Ancien Regime, and once again Napoleon's able subordinates in public office greatly assisted him in his financial reforms. Through the efforts of France's Minister of Finance, Martin-Michel Charles Godin, the Director of the Treasury, François Barbé-Marbois, and prominent French merchant Nicolas François, Count Molienne, Napoleon was able to increase the efficiency of tax assessment and collection throughout the state. Another important financial reform of Napoleon was his creation of the Bank of France in 1800, which was granted full control over issuing paper currency and responsibility in administering the national debt and interests. Through these financial reforms, France's economic situation improved vastly in the early 1800s, allowing the first consul to afford his expensive wars against the coalition armies of Europe. When it came to administrating France's overseas colonies in the Americas, Napoleon saw the futility in properly maintaining the country's overextended and isolated colonial territories. The success of the Haitian Revolution in the West Indies would lead him to give up on any ambitions he had of reviving a strong French power base in the New World.
And that's 100% true. You got to remember, of course, number one, France can't compete in terms of a navy with nations like Britain. But yeah, the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture leading that. Napoleon initially tries to put it down, and he thinks he's got a good plan to do that. He sends an army to overthrow the revolution, and it just is a nightmare scenario. He tries to reinstitute slavery there. None of it goes well, and it was in the aftermath of one of the previous wars that Napoleon had negotiated getting the Louisiana Territory back from Spain because it had been ceded to Spain in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. And so he got it back, but he didn't hold it very long. And once things failed in Haiti, he realized that it was a bridge too far, really, for them to try and have territory in North America and in the Caribbean. So that's when he decides to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States.
And he eventually sold off the expansive colony of Louisiana to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, granting the French government vast sums of money to finance Napoleon's wars and reform projects. Reforms to the French economy also provided for the improvement of private business ventures. full employment and the opening of foreign markets opened up lucrative new business opportunities for French merchants. However,
so you can see a scenario where if all the wars had ended at this point, right? If you have no more wars of the coalition, you don't have a British blockade of French ports, and Napoleon's basically left to run the country, maybe France becomes the world superpower. Maybe the British don't become the dominant superpower of the 19th century. Maybe things look different in the 20th century.
when it came to overseas trading, Napoleon's economic policies failed miserably once hostilities renewed with Great Britain in 1803.
Yep.
Napoleon had tried to induce an economic blockade on the British Isles through a policy known as the Continental System, but enforcing this across the empire's rapidly expanding territories and markets was easier said than done, and the lucrative...
See, there are times in history when the British used their navy to impose their will. This is an example. In the 20th century, you have the naval blockade of the Germans, which is probably one of the most important factors in the defeat of the Central Powers in the First World War. And so when countries can't compete with that in terms of their navy, they have to find some other way, right? For the Germans in World War I, it's unrestricted submarine warfare. For the French, it's the Continental System. They've got to find some way to respond to a British naval blockade that they can't take on directly.
lucrative practice of smuggling British goods into continental European markets soon became commonplace. Despite this setback, government enforcement and supervision of the French economy produced great material wealth and prosperity to individual subjects in the empire. Perhaps the greatest and longest-lasting legacies of Napoleon's constructive work reforms was his implementation of a new civil code, commonly referred to as the Napoleonic Code.
100%.
As first consul, he had taken a vested interest in reforming the faulty legal codex of the French Republic, and in 1800 he formed two commissions to review the law, which were later combined into a single body, run by second consul Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambacérès. The commission's proposals were passed to the Judicial Committee of the Council of State for review. Before
So this is what I mean. You can't reduce Napoleon Bonaparte to he was a great general. It's so much more than that. And he devoted every bit as much energy to his political reforms as he did to being a general on the battlefield. That's what he really wanted his legacy to be. He is so much more than just one thing.
then being presented to Napoleon for final approval. Earlier attempts by the revolutionary government to reform France's legal system had greatly assisted Napoleon in his current efforts to implement the Civil Code. The basic tenets of the Civil Code, or Napoleonic Code, upheld the principles of toleration, equity, the value and sanctity of private property, and the central significance of patriarchal family values.
Yeah, and on the surface, don't seem like bad things, right? The patriarchal family values, okay, he was very much a product of his time. And I don't want to be too super critical of him on this because he really was no different than most other people at this time. Doesn't make it right in terms of how we see things today, but he was very much about men are the ones that are supposed to be in government and in society and in the workplace. Women are mothers and wives, and they take care of the home. That is their place. But he also worked really, really hard at making sure that fathers were devoted to caring for their families. And he even put things into the legal code that made it of great benefit to you to be a husband and a father and to make sure that you were caring for your family.
Napoleon's Civil Code was publicized between 1802 and 1804, with further additions for commercial, criminal and penal codes adopted in 1807, 1808 and 1810. Napoleon's efforts to reform the legal codex of France had a lasting legacy on not just Europe, but legal systems everywhere, and elements of the Napoleonic Code are still in place in countries formerly controlled by the Empire, such as France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and regions of Germany. Through the examination of Napoleon Bonaparte's public, government, and legal reforms as First Consul and Emperor, it is clear to see that there were many positive aspects to Napoleon's reign. However, his rule did not come without drawbacks and scrutiny. Scholars and historians often debate the role Napoleon played directly in the series of highly destructive wars which ravaged Europe from 1792 to 1815, now known to history as the Napoleonic Wars. He was no pacifist and was certainly fond of war and conquest. According to Napoleonic historian David G. Chandler, during the 23-odd years of his active career, he fought no less than 60 battles. Between March 1804 and April 1815, it is estimated that around 2 million native-born Frenchmen saw active service in his many armies over the years.
But the question is, how many of those wars were started by Napoleon or by the French versus started by other people with the intent of restoring the Bourbon monarchy, with the intent of destroying the French Republic? I'm not saying Napoleon didn't like war. I'm not saying he didn't start some of these wars. He absolutely invaded Russia and was responsible for the deaths involved there. But some of these other wars, man, you can't lay them at his feet. You just can't.
Total casualty estimates from the Napoleonic Wars change frequently and will probably never be fully known. But anywhere from as low as 450,000 to as high as 1,750,000 French and French allied troops were casualties of the war in this 11-year time span.
We get really confusing when we talk about casualties, and they did this in the movie. At the end of the movie, the Napoleon movie, they throw up these casualty figures, right? And they use the word casualty to mean death, and that's not what a casualty is. A casualty is anybody who is a healthy soldier beforehand and is not, at least for a time afterwards. So, for example, the Battle of Gettysburg, you had 51,000 casualties. At the Battle of Waterloo, we're talking about probably 50 to 60,000 casualties. That's the men who were killed, who will die of wounds later, who were wounded but survived, who are captured and, at least for a time, imprisoned and no longer fighting, who are sent to prison camps or otherwise incapacitated in some way. It is not equal to the word death. I think the number they just quoted there would be dead overall. Some people are casualties. Some people could be wounded 5 different times and still come back. One guy can be 5 casualties in that situation. They did that at the end of the movie. They said that something like 50,000 dead in a single day at Waterloo. That is not true. It was probably more like 10,000 that died that day. There may have been others who died later, but it was 50,000 plus casualties. Killed, wounded, missing, captured.
Napoleon's actual degree of responsibility for the wars which bear his name are also highly debatable. Besides his invasions of Portugal, Spain and Russia, he was typically the defender, warding off invasions of his empire by the coalition armies.
Yep.
There is no doubt, however, that many of these invasions were provoked by the emperor himself. But to say that Napoleon was directly responsible for the wars of his age is a bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
Britain, France and their allies had been fighting wars with one another for over a century prior to the revolution, and it's unlikely that, had Napoleon not risen to power, these frequent conflicts wouldn't have still continued. In terms of domestic affairs, Napoleon displayed tyrannical rule by overseeing a propaganda machine that glorified the French Empire and its emperor. Besides,
I'm not saying there weren't aspects of Napoleon's rule that were tyrannical. I don't think using propaganda to instill patriotism and support for your government is inherently tyrannical. I think if you use propaganda to outright lie to people to get them to support things they otherwise might not, maybe. I don't know. When I think tyrannical, propaganda is not where my mind goes.
the previously mentioned propaganda art he sponsored, Napoleon's imperial government directly administered public education, which encouraged mathematics and science, but also banned most, if not all, liberal arts and forbade the teaching of modern history. Instead, the imperial public education system taught nationalistic propaganda about the period of Charlemagne and his Carolingian Empire that Napoleon sought to emulate in France.
Now, again, I agree that by intentionally not teaching certain things, now maybe we're straying a little bit into the tyrannical territory. But again, instilling pride in people for their history by teaching things like Charlemagne, I don't think that's inherently bad. I don't think there's anything wrong with American history teaching pride in things like the American Revolution and George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and things like that. Doesn't mean you can't decide for yourself whether or not you support those things, but I don't think that that's a great example of why he's tyrannical.
It's important to note that when Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, he essentially turned his back on many of the ideals of the revolution he had fought for, and restored much of the autocratic rule he had fought against.
Fair point.
When it comes to his tyranny in regards to foreign affairs, Napoleon's conquests and campaigns speak for themselves. His motivations to conquer vast amounts of territory in Germany, Iberia, and Russia were usually driven by his ego and lust for power. In the case of Spain and Portugal, Napoleon's reputation takes a great hit in these countries. In what would prove a serious miscalculation, Napoleon overthrew the Spanish Bourbon monarchy and placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne.
Yeah, one of the things I would definitely highlight if I'm talking about Napoleon going too far and being more tyrannical is the nepotism that he displayed in terms of how he placed a lot of his family in these positions of power, like Joseph in Spain and his other brothers getting things like Holland and Italy and those sorts of things. That's definitely, I mean, once he becomes emperor, there definitely is a heavy skew toward more tyrannical government, more autocratic, getting away from the ideals of the revolution. Absolutely.
Napoleon had looked down on Spain and her people as backwards, overly spiritual, and practically run by the Roman Catholic Church. His efforts to modernize Spain and Portugal were greatly opposed by the Spanish and Portuguese people, whom they saw as occupiers rather than liberators. Spanish resistance against Bonaparte's rule was violently suppressed in the Dos de Mayo uprising of May 2, 1808. Ultimately, it would take the aid of the British and 5 years of bloody campaigning in the Peninsular War before the French were driven out and the Bourbon monarchy restored. The war in Spain had been a costly blunder for Napoleon's empire, in both lives and expenses. By taking a closer look at Napoleon's role in the bloody conflicts that ravaged Europe from 1800 to 1815, it is clear to see his role as tyrant and dictator come out, and portray him as the ogre that coalition propaganda made him out to be. Opinion, both public and scholarly, on Napoleon's historical legacy is like a pendulum throughout the generations.
True.
Constantly.
And that's true for a lot of historical figures, right? Napoleon's going to be debated endlessly for all of history. And right now, especially, there's a lot of talk about him because of the movie.
Swinging in one direction or another. After the return of the emperor's body to Paris in 1840, the French people once more sought the return of the Bonapartes, and when his cousin, Napoleon III, formed the Second French Empire in
Nephew. It was his grandnephew. Or was it just his nephew? I think it was his brother Louis's son, wasn't he? Yeah, so Napoleon III is the son of Louis Bonaparte, who was Napoleon's younger brother, who was the King of Holland. But Napoleon III is also the biological grandson of Josephine, Empress Josephine, because Napoleon's brother Louis married Josephine's daughter Hortense, and their child is Napoleon III. So he's Napoleon's nephew.
In 1852, he would openly encourage the positive image of his late uncle's reputation and legacy.
Now he said uncle.
Especially after the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, the French people would look nostalgically on the times of France's greatness under Emperor Napoleon I. Generals across Europe would study his tactics and strategies to try and discover his secret to success on the battlefield. But after the horrors of World War I, public opinion would again shift towards Napoleon's contemporary depiction as a warmonger who spilled gallons of European blood in his personal pursuit of glory.
Yep.
After World War II, the pendulum swung back to center, and Napoleon's image as either a great reformer or tyrant remains a debated topic to this day. As David Chandler states, the Earl of Clarendon's remarks on Oliver Cromwell perhaps best summarise Napoleon Bonaparte: a great bad man.
Huh.
We plan to cover the fascinating lives of history's other great leaders in the future, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it.
So that was a good kind of summary of all of that for sure, and I think they do a good job of kind of looking at both sides of it. And there is no black or white, like I said at the beginning of all of this, when it comes to men like Napoleon. He's a very complicated figure. He's not the black and white Hitler or Stalin who you can just say, man, overall, absolutely, really, really bad. Napoleon's not that kind of person. He's much more complicated than that. So definitely check out this video and some of Kings and Generals' other stuff. I want to encourage you to support their channel so they can keep making great content like this. Thank you to Chris in Old Hickory, Tennessee, and also Ron in Hendersonville, Tennessee. Thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. If you want to learn more about becoming a patron, you can check out the link in the description of every video or there on the screen. You can see how to check out Patreon. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.